Thank you, sir, for the lovely introduction. And I would also like to thank ma'am for the opportunity to speak in this course. Guidelines on clinical trials. Most of us as clinicians, I am a hardcore clinician, and most of us think that if we have appropriate funding, I'll be able to do a fantastic trial. But I think I'm in the learning process myself, and I think and I have excellent guidance from Professor Radhika Tandon. And I think that's a very wrong approach to doing a clinical trial, and it is imperative to understand what are the various aspects which lead to a success of a clinical trial. Several times we try to pass on the blame to other people and other things around us, which feel is not making our trial a success. So I'm just going to touch upon. Probably I will not have the time to delve into the depths of these, but I will try to make it clear or what are probably the various aspects which one needs to understand, which are related to clinical trials. So what exactly is a clinical trial? Before this, I would like to acknowledge that I have taken a lot of images from the net to make this rather uninteresting talk a little more pictorial and interesting. I'd like to acknowledge all those websites for the pictorial representations. So what is a clinical trial? Clinical trials are research studies which help to answer specific questions and find effective ways of either preventing or treating a disease, and they are fundamental to development of innovative vaccines or medicines or devices or treatment modalities. It is important to understand the clinical trials ecosystem. This is a healthy integration of basic scientists, translational scientists, then clinical scientists who are able to bring into practice what these people have probably established, the community clinicians as well. Patients, of course, form a very important part of this, and then comes in your funding agencies. So it is a healthy integration of a diverse group of people who are going to contribute to a success of clinical trials. So in brief, if you're going to look at what exactly or how to explain a clinical trial will consist of preclinical or laboratory studies which are probably bring into existence thought about a particular new drug or a particular new modality or anything which is going to be established. This is then put in through phases of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4 studies, and then you establish the entire process. Just to go through it in a nutshell, first when you propose a protocol, then a protocol has to be put into shape and has to be approved by all the participating investigators. Then the principal investigator goes through the meticulous process of selecting the co-workers. Then you put this assembled protocol to the approval process, which is looked over by various regulatory authorities. Then once the approval has been sought, it goes in for patient recruitment and the participation, which is the process of how the clinical trial is taken through or how it's conducted. Then you have the data entry, the statistical process to analyze your results, presenting and publication of the results of the study obtained, the data filling and registrations. So what are the stages of a clinical trial? You have a preclinical phases and the clinical phase. So the preclinical phase, usually laboratory studies, and this could be in vitro, in vivo, it could be process development and GMP productions. Then you go in through the various clinical phases of the study. The phase 1 study usually could take about days or weeks. It tries to establish the safety of the modality which you are looking at, the drug or the treatment process. When you look at the phase 2 and the phase 3, they look at the various expanded safeties which could extend into weeks or months. A phase 1 trial is usually done in a nutshell, sort of tens of people. So it's not a large study population, whereas when you look at phase 2 and phase 3 phases, it's done on perhaps hundreds or thousands of people, and again can go over a period of time. And your phase 4 or the post-marketing studies or surveillance studies are really establishing how this particular drug or the modality or the treatment is working in the population. So this is again a repetition of the same. So what are the various clinical trials? They could be either treatment trials, they could be prevention trials, they could be quality of life trials, or could be diagnostic trials. It is also imperative to understand the pyramid of importance of clinical trials or clinical studies, and randomized control trials, of course, come on top of all the others. Among the type of clinical trials, they could either be observational or could be experimental. The observational ones could be descriptive or analytical involving cohorts or case control studies. Experimental or clinical interventions could be either uncontrolled or controlled studies. Uncontrolled, when there is no control group, it's just a single group study. Control groups, where you're either not randomizing them, then they become a non-randomized group and a randomized group. It is also imperative for principal investigators to understand what study design will be apt for the particular initiative, particular objective or aim which they want to establish in their study. So it is of good importance to understand that there are various studies: parallel, crossover, factorial, randomized withdrawal, adaptive, superiority studies or inferiority studies. And it is important to understand which particular study design would be effective in bringing out the objective which they are aiming to establish. Most of the studies in ophthalmic literature, in ophthalmic clinical scenarios, tend to be parallel studies, and they're either non-randomized or controlled studies, and they could also be superiority or inferiority studies. Larger clinical trials could be adaptive designs as well. I would not delve into the depths of these. It is also imperative for the principal investigator to understand the various methods of randomization if they're going to, if they are adopting such methods for their study designs. A quick look at the clinical trial regulations. The DCGI in India, under the CDSCO, has the primary responsibility of regulating the various clinical trials in India. The investigators also should also be aware of the Declaration of the Helsinki, the ICMR general guidelines and codes, which gives you all the principles for research using human objects and biomedical research. There are other regulatory guidelines, and it is good to read them all up. There are very extensive literature available on this: the GCP guidelines, the GMP practice guidelines, and the Drug Cosmetics Acts, etc. Another important fact is to understand the various stakeholders in a clinical trial. So you have sponsors, you have contract research organization, you have the investigators, you have the ethical committee, and the study subjects. Just to define them briefly, the sponsor is one who takes the responsibility for initiating, management, and financing a clinical trial. So who's a contract research organization? A CRO is an organization contracted by the sponsor to perform the various activities related to a trial. An investigator is particularly responsible for the conduct of a clinical trial in a particular site or the various sites which have been enrolled into the trial. Ethics committee, this ensures protection of the rights, safety, and well-being of the subjects who are going to be recruited, and also ensure this is a public insurance that the rights of the enrolled patients are protected. Study subjects are the patients who voluntarily enroll themselves to participate in a clinical trial. There are various duties which are linked to the different members of the team of a clinical trial, as such as following: administration of the consent forms, case record keeping, and the various other detailed data management which is required, the various filing procedures, the various approval procedures, the various statistical procedures. Everything needs to be documented and kept in a confidential manner. A brief look at the various ethical guidelines. I've just given you also the websites which one could refer to, and the ethical guidelines for biomedical research for human participants is given in the ICMR websites, and the code of conduct for scientists, the clinical laboratory practice in case your clinical trial is going to involve these study modalities. You do have clinical sites where you could log in and see what are the various trials which are going on related to your area of interest. The Central Drug Standard Control Organization is a main regulatory authority in India as far as drugs are concerned, and of particular importance to understand that of late all the newer guideline regulations makes it mandatory to establish or define the quantum of compensation which is to be given for the subjects in the event of serious adverse effects. So the principal investigator's primary duty remains in establishing what is going to be the serious adverse effect, whether it's death-related, non-death-related, quantify and define. There are formulas given on these guidelines to calculate these compensations. It has now become mandatory that these are defined clearly in the protocol process itself, so that the various permissions, regulations, ethical committee clearances are got without a lot of hitches. And again, now I think it's become mandatory to do an audio-visual recording of the consent process. It's no longer just a paper-related process. It is the principal duty of the primary investigator to be able to do an audio-video recording, and there is no excuse that it's a busy OPD service and these cannot be obtained. And these records are to be kept in confidential by the principal investigator for up to about 5 years after the conclusion of the trial. Thank you.